In past lessons, we have discussed the Carolingian and the 12th century Renaissances. However, generally speaking, when you think of the Renaissance, you are thinking of the Italian Renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries. Renaissance means rebirth, and the Italian Renaissance witnessed a concurrent transformation of the medieval world into the modern world. The rebirth in question was a revival of classical styles in literature, architecture, sculpture, and painting. In painting, the Renaissance was more than just a revival, for we will see a number of new developments. The Renaissance was born from the recovery period after the Black Death that saw the re-establishment of a flourishing culture. Although the humanists liked, or wanted to think so, the Renaissance was not a complete break with the medieval period, for of all the figures we mentioned were more or less devout Christians, a key feature of the medieval age as well. The attempt to merge a revival of Greco-Roman learning with Christianity would take place in Italy, although it would be even more prevalent in Northern Europe, as we will see in the next lesson. I've already talked about Petrarch in our last lesson. He would become known as the father of humanism because he also advocated a return to the Latin style of classical Rome, especially that of Cicero. He believed that the language of the medieval period had become corrupted and needed to be restored. To this end, he was opposed to scholastic theologians and the university culture that he believed perpetuated these things. Petrarch was not a fan of the logical methods of medieval scholasticism either, preferring the rhetorical style of the ancients. It was Petrarch who coined the term Dark Age to describe the Middle Ages, and he defined it as such because of his misperception of its level of intellectual sophistication. Nevertheless, the term is stuck in some quarters, and has been used to break European history from its medieval into its modern period. Petrarch was a deeply committed Christian, so he wasn't opposed to the Christianity of the Middle Ages. This is shown quite clearly in his dialogue with St. Augustine, titled The Secret. As previously mentioned, Petrarch was best known in his own day for his love sonnets, but he also wrote a Latin epic poem, Africa, about Scipio and the Punic Wars. He was chosen to be the Roman poet laureate in 1341. Perhaps Petrarch's most important contribution was the inspiration he gave to others to reinvigorate classical scholarship. Boccaccio, who I've also talked about, was one of the figures inspired by Petrarch. So too was Lorenzo Valla, who I discussed regarding the exposure of the donation of Constantine as a forgery. This was the birth of philology, or historical linguistics. Much of humanist scholarship originally developed outside of the university system, for the obvious reason that it was opposed to so much of that culture. Instead, humanists were generally supported by wealthy patrons who used these associations to increase their prestige. This is part of the reason for the elite nature of much of this study. Humanists were often hired to teach the children of the elite, and would eventually found schools that emphasized classical studies. This emphasis would last into the 20th century. Petrarch was not a politician, but a relatively low-ranking member of the clergy. He did not desire an active public life, and his chosen career enabled him to spend much of his life in quiet, solo contemplation. This may explain why he rejected his father's plans for him to become a lawyer. Despite Petrarch's advocacy of such a life, many other humanists loyally served their states. The most famous were Coluccio Salutati and Leonardo Bruni, who both served as chancellors of Florence. These men encouraged the active life, whereby the best life of man was one that put study to use in the service of the state. This idea would later become known as civic humanism. Florence became the center of the Italian Renaissance. I've already mentioned how Salutati and Bruni were prominent figures in Florentine public life. Florentine politics of the 15th century, however, were dominated by the Medici family, who first entered the historical record as bankers. By the lifetime of Cosimo, they had become the effective but behind-the-scenes rulers of Florence. The pinnacle of their power came during the life of Lorenzo, nicknamed the Magnificent. The Medici family became so wealthy, powerful, and renowned that their influence extended beyond Florence. 3 popes came from the Medici family: Leo X, Clement VII, and Leo XI. Also, 2 queens of France were Medici women, Catherine and Marie. Most significantly for our purposes, they were the greatest patrons of Renaissance artists, and funded Botticelli, Michelangelo, and Marsilio Ficino. Ficino was a philosopher and scholar who first translated the entire collection of Plato's works into Latin. He also translated the Neoplatonists, such as Plotinus. Ficino was also famous for his own works and interpretations of philosophical systems. The Medici did occasionally run into difficulties, and were driven from Italy twice, although both times they were able to convince the Spanish to help them retake power. In the end, they ruled for centuries, although essentially as puppets for the Spanish. One of the key figures in the first Medici exile was Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar. In 1494, the French invaded Florence, for reasons I will make clear in just a moment. The French deposed the Medici, and the people of Florence declared a republic. The key figure in this republic was Savonarola, who was a gifted public speaker and won the crowds to his point of view. One of his favorite topics was the corruption, luxury, and pride of the people of Florence. He even convinced hundreds of Florentines to destroy the evidence of their sins, and a great many pieces of art, in addition to mirrors and other tools of sin, were publicly burnt. This was known as the bonfire of the vanities. Savonarola originally gained quite a following for his accurate prophecies regarding the fall of the Medici, but he eventually lost his popular support. The Church, which backed the Medici exiles, excommunicated him, and Pope Alexander VI had him convicted of heresy and later burned. You should remember that in the High Middle Ages, a number of northern Italian cities banded together as the Lombard League to resist being controlled by the Holy Roman Empire. From this point on, they were effectively self-governing institutions, and therefore rather different from fiefs or cities in centralized monarchies. Some were ruled by republics, while others were controlled by some sort of single ruler, often known as a despot. As a result, Italian politics was messy, and the cities were often at each other's throats in an attempt to keep control of their own territory and dominate that of their neighbors. This situation led to the development of mercenaries, known as condottieri, who would be hired by a city to fight their wars for them. Bartolomeo Colleoni and Gattamelata are examples of such condottieri. Gattamelata would have a famous statue made of him by someone no less than Donatello. Francesco Sforza, however, was the most successful condottieri, since he was able to seize the city of Milan in 1450 and establish a dynasty that would last until the French conquered the city. By 1454, things were calming down in Italy, as 5 states established a semblance of supremacy. These were Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples, and the Papal States. In 1454, the Treaty of Lodi created an alliance of Florence, Venice, and Milan that would provide an amount of stability between these perennially warring states. The Kingdom of Naples was the largest of these states, controlling all of southern Italy and Sicily, although the King of Naples frequently lost his throne. During the Middle Ages, the Neapolitan throne was held at one time or another by the Byzantines, Muslims, Normans, Hohenstaufens, French, and Spanish. In the 15th century, the period we are discussing, the Spanish Aragonese controlled Naples. The Papal States were those lands that were governed by the Pope, but they were in a pitiful state. While the Pope had lived in Avignon, and when the Great Schism made it difficult for any pope to concentrate on a single task, many of the lands of the Papal States reverted to local control. Popes throughout the 14th and 15th centuries would aim to re-establish the Papal States firmly in the hands of the Pope. The Treaty of Lodi provided 40 years of peace, but then things fell apart. In 1494, the French King Charles VIII decided to resume the French claim to the Kingdom of Naples and invaded Italy. To get there, he needed to travel the length of western Italy, and I've already mentioned his intervention against the Medici while on this trip. Charles took Naples from the Spanish ruler, but then almost all of Italy turned against him and drove him out. 5 years later, the French King Louis XII invaded Milan and took it away from the Sforzas. For a second time, an Italian alliance drove the French out, but that still didn't settle things. Francis I, who was almost continuing at war with the Spanish, also invaded Italy. The countryside and cities of Italy were devastated by each of these invasions by foreigners, and these invasions are generally considered to be the endpoint of the Italian Renaissance. Particularly sad was the destruction meted out on Rome in 1527, when the imperial armies sacked the city out of frustration for delayed salaries. The most famous political thinker of the Italian Renaissance was Niccolò Machiavelli, who came of age during this period of chaos in which Italy was invaded seemingly constantly by outside forces. His most famous work is The Prince, which is an explicit appeal to the Medici family to take control of the city and serve as an example to other Italians to resist foreign domination. In this book, the prince is encouraged to be an unscrupulous individual who would do anything to get what he wanted. The end justified the means. Machiavelli supports his case by pointing out times in history when men who acted in this way were successful. Machiavelli even argues that the teachings of Christianity limit the options available to rulers. Two of those who found themselves under assault by Machiavelli were the popes and the condottieri. The popes had worked to keep the Italians divided in order to increase their own power, while mercenaries profited from the very wars that were destroying Italy. Famously, Machiavelli argued that the city should get rid of mercenaries and replace them with citizen militias that would fight hard because they were defending their homes and families. You might see some elements of Greek hoplite soldiers here. Most people who know Machiavelli only know him from The Prince, and tend to believe that these were Machiavelli's beliefs. A compelling argument can be made, however, that the prince was calling for desperate measures for desperate times. In Machiavelli's other major work, The Discourses, he points out that republics are far superior to despotisms. The Discourses, a more thoughtful, reasoned work, may express Machiavelli's point of view more clearly than The Prince. Both of his works were written at the end of his life, after he had been exiled from Florence when the Republic was overthrown. Although bitter over his experiences, his works do show his practical experience alongside his humanistic studies. The artistic elements of the Italian Renaissance sought to revive the classical ideals of harmony and proportion. This is evident in architecture, where Italians resumed the use of the dome, which had been abandoned in both the Romanesque and Gothic styles. The first example of this was the Florentine cathedral designed by Brunelleschi and constructed between 1420 and 1436. That's the dome on the left below. A century later, in 1546, the magnificent dome over St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and designed by Michelangelo, was constructed. That's below here to the right. Renaissance architecture also resumed the use of classical columns in their construction projects. During the medieval period, sculptors focused on producing reliefs, or else statues that were constructed as a part of the overall style of a Romanesque or Gothic building. With the Renaissance, we see a return to more classical models, such as the freestanding nude and equestrian statues. The first great Renaissance sculptor was Donatello, who produced great examples of both. His first was the first nude sculpture in centuries, which is the David, and he also produced a monument to the condottieri Gattamelata that was the first equestrian statue in the Renaissance. Michelangelo, who had come to dominate Renaissance art like almost no one else, produced some of the most fantastic pieces of Renaissance sculpture. The Pietà depicts the Virgin Mary holding the dead Jesus after he was taken off the cross, and has a powerful testament to the ability to represent emotions in marble. Powerful in a completely different way was Michelangelo's David, which you see here, a 17-foot-tall sculpture that is one of the most realistically detailed sculptures ever, even down to the details of veins, muscles, and hair. The David was made for the city of Florence, to stand in the city's plaza as an emblem of the city's ability to resist more powerful foes. Most of the time, however, Michelangelo worked for the Pope. This is where the Pietà is located today. Perhaps even more famous is Michelangelo's fresco series painted onto the roof of the Sistine Chapel within the Vatican between 1508 and 1512. Renaissance painting would develop from the innovations of Giotto, and the first Renaissance painter is generally considered to be Masaccio. Masaccio closely studied Giotto and developed a more exact way to represent three-dimensional space. You can see Masaccio's Trinity here to the right. This method of three-dimensionality and depth was further refined by Brunelleschi, and more so by Leon Battista Alberti, who described the process in his work On Painting of 1436. Another major innovation in Renaissance painting was chiaroscuro. This means light and dark, and is the attempt to accurately render the play of light and shadows within a painting. Through the use of three-dimensional perspective and chiaroscuro, Renaissance artists were able to produce the most naturalistic paintings yet. The premier examples of such artists were Michelangelo, Raphael, and Leonardo da Vinci. Since these men, and others, could create such realistic portrayals, they were often hired to make portraits, and indeed included their patrons in the backgrounds and sides of paintings that weren't even ostensibly portraits. The term Renaissance man has come down to the present time to describe geniuses who are masters of a number of different talents that exhibited their virtuosity. This term obviously comes from this period, where a number of men became experts in a number of fields, some related, some not. Perhaps the best example of this is Leonardo da Vinci, who is best known for painting, sculpture, and architecture, but also a master at engineering, science, inventions, and music. His works The Last Supper and Mona Lisa are considered some of the finest pieces ever created, and I've reproduced them here for you. He also theorized the possibility of helicopters and drew up plans for better and more accurate cannons, and the most efficient ways of forming irrigation systems. Michelangelo, who I have already discussed as a painter and sculptor, was also a poet. He also contributed to later history the caricature of a tormented artist. Michelangelo openly declared that his genius drove him to attempt newer and greater achievements. The Renaissance also witnessed a number of literary masterpieces. One of these was the Oration on the Dignity of Man, composed by Pico della Mirandola. Pico was one of Ficino's students who set off to create a universal theory of human knowledge. He was convinced of the magnificence and importance of human reason, which is the primary theme of his oration. He was also heavily influenced by the kinds of mysticism that Ficino studied, but Pico also read and interpreted the Kabbalah, a collection of Jewish mystical writings. In the end, Pico was influenced by Savonarola and became convinced that his learning was a vanity. He abandoned it. Vernacular history writing also appeared in the Italian Renaissance. It was written by Machiavelli, as well as by Francesco Guicciardini, who wrote the history of Italy based on primary source materials. Giorgio Vasari applied the same techniques to his history of art, titled The Lives of the Artists. This work gives us our best piece of information about the Renaissance artists I've described so far. A final piece of Renaissance literature was the Book of the Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione. He discussed the skills, rules, and education needed to get ahead in the world of the Renaissance. In particular, he emphasizes how well-rounded an education someone needs. In effect, you need to become something of a Renaissance man to catch the attention of the powerful foreigners who now controlled Italy. Although typically overlooked in a survey of Renaissance innovations, some of the most important developments of the time were economic. Without these new practices, the wealth that was necessary to sponsor such art wouldn't have been possible. One of the most important of these is double-entry bookkeeping, which tallied accounts and debits together to provide a full view of the economic position of a business at any moment in time. Bills of exchange were also introduced. These are early forms of a check that allowed merchants to conduct large transactions far from home without having to carry huge amounts of gold and silver with them. This would have made them susceptible to robbery. Maritime insurance was also developed to minimize the disastrous effects of a sunk ship. This would increase the confidence of investors. Branch offices of businesses were also opened, meaning that the Medici bank system could have local branches in places outside Florence. Usury was still banned by the church, but generally allowed loopholes that effectively meant that interest payments could be made. The business partnership was also developed, called in Italy a commenda. This system was when one person or a group of people could contribute the money for a business enterprise, while another person would actually carry out the activity. They would then split the profits. Using such a system, people could invest in projects that weren't their specialization, and could diversify their business interests in a way impossible in the past.